This podcast is sponsored by ADT. ADT can design and install a smart home just for you, backed by 24/7 protection.
Like Doorman Service, which is an ADT automation that unlocks the doors for packages, friends, or your kids, all controlled from the ADT app or the sound of your voice and backed by 24/7 protection.
Just visit ADT.com/smart to learn more about how ADT can design and install a secure smart home just for you and your family. Are you all thinking about getting your home more organized? You definitely should talk to California Closets. Their expert design consultants work with you so you can together create the perfect solution for your bedroom closet, your pantry, or your home office. You name it, they can do it.
I had a terrific experience with California Closets. They turned an empty room into a beautiful closet, and we're all very happy with the results. To do the same in your house, for any space in your house, visit the experts at californiaclosets.com/Katie to book your in-home consultation today. That's californiaclosets.com/Katie. California Closets, it's like a little slice of organized heaven.
Hey, Brian.
Hi, Katie.
Brian, that song is for you because it's a wonderful day here at the pod because the midterm elections are right around the corner on Tuesday, November 6th, and it's all about the midterms today on our podcast, Brian.
And I couldn't be more excited. I'm like a kid in a candy store, Katie.
Most polls, as you know, are favoring Democrats to take control of the House, and the Republicans will likely keep control of the Senate. But then again, after 2016, who really knows, right?
Nobody. Well, if that does happen, Katie, if the projections are right, it would really change the balance of power in this country. And on the off chance that the Democrats take the House and the Senate, well, things will look a lot different for President Trump and for American politics.
We've been hearing so much about the midterms in the news these days. It's sometimes hard to cut through the opinions and memes and downright vitriol to actually understand what's happening in all these races. So today, we've invited Clare Malone, a senior political writer at FiveThirtyEight, to give us a picture of where all these races stand and which ones we should pay attention to on Tuesday, and also to give us her view on the big picture, Brian.
Kind of what are the stakes of this election? And then we're going to talk to a wonderful author, Michael Lewis. He has a new book out called The Fifth Risk, which is actually very relevant to the election next week.
Michael Lewis, of course, wrote The Big Short. He wrote Moneyball. And now for The Fifth Risk, he spent months talking to former and current employees of the federal government. And he believes that the Trump administration is wreaking havoc from within. In his view, either political hacks are in charge or appointees more concerned about self-interest than the public interests.
We've got a lot to cover today, so...
Oh, wait a second, Brian. Are you hearing that, or is it just in my head?
It's just in your head. No, I'm actually hearing that.
That's right. It's our new theme music. We've given our show's sound a bit of a facelift. No funny remarks here, by the way.
Well, we should say to the tabloid reporters, that's the only facelift that's happened around here. But
bumch. And we want to say a big thank you to Jared Arnold, who composed the new music for us.
Yeah, I really like it. It's sounding kind of groovy. What do you think, Katie?
Well, I try to avoid using the word groovy. I haven't used that since like 1968, but I would give it a 98 for dancing. Anyway, enough about our new music. Let's get to our conversation with Clare Malone from FiveThirtyEight. We began by asking her what's really at stake in next week's elections. For people who aren't like us, who haven't been glued to their seats, paying attention to every
healthy
poll.
People.
Yeah, normal people, in other words. What is at stake for these elections?
Well, midterm elections are pretty much always a reaction to the party who's in power. And the Republicans have a lot of control over the government. So they have the White House, they have the House of Representatives, and they have the Senate. And I think, as is probably no surprise to anyone in America, we're in a highly polarized, partisan period of American life, and we have a president who has played into that quite a bit. And so I think when we talk about the stakes of this election, we are talking about, if we're getting nitty-gritty, the possibility that, if Democrats theoretically retained control of both houses of Congress, they could potentially impeach the president or, try to remove him from office. So that's, I think, if you're going for the 30,000 foot up view of things, that's what's at stake.
We're talking about all House seats, 33 Senate seats, 36 governorships, state legislatures, basically a lot of spots.
Yes. I'm glad you brought up state legislatures, and there's also attorney general's races. There's a lot of state level seats that are at play here that we don't talk as much about. But right now it's looking like the Democrats have a pretty good chance of taking back the House of Representatives. So we have a forecasting model, and we give them about, let's say, an 80% shot of taking back the House of Representatives. The Senate is kind of flipped, where the Democrats have about only a 20% chance of taking the Senate. And I think you can kind of, if you want to look back 2 years to the split that we saw in the popular vote and the Electoral College, they're sort of mirrored in the patterns that we're seeing in the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the House of Representatives, that's parallel is the popular vote, which the Democrat Hillary Clinton won by 3 million. And then you've got the Senate, which we can compare to the Electoral College. And it's interesting because the Senate sort of plays to Republicans' advantages in these rural states where votes are, I guess, more effectively economically distributed. We talk about that, where people aren't clustering in certain places.
Yeah, will you just explain that a little bit for people? Give us a quick civics lesson, if you could, Claire,
sure.
on gerrymandering and sort of why the Senate is so different than House races.
Yeah, well, I think we always want to start and talk about the way that Americans have self-sorted. So Democrats have tended to, in the past few election cycles, past couple of decades, be in big cities or in suburban areas surrounding big cities. And the reason why Republicans have an advantage in the Electoral College and in the Senate map is that their votes they're all over, even in small states. So they might win a bunch of small counties in North Dakota, and that counts for a lot. A Senate seat in North Dakota is worth just as much as a Senate seat in California. And the appeal right now of Republicans seems to be being received better by people in these exurban or, rural places. And that's a problem, obviously, that the Democrats are trying to kind of claw their way back on.
So if you want to think about it in terms of waves, people have talked about this election potentially being a wave election for the Democrats. There are a couple of seawalls that the Republicans have built up to protect themselves from these waves. One is, just because of the way the House seats are drawn and in some cases gerrymandered to benefit one party, the Democrats have to win the House popular vote by about 6 points, which is like a near landslide margin, in order to win control of the House. And in the Senate, it's not gerrymandered because the state borders are what they've always been, but North Dakota has 2 Senate seats, Wyoming has 2 Senate seats, et cetera, and California has 2 Senate seats. And so there's a bit of a bias there as well.
But didn't things start to change a bit even just a couple of weeks ago for the Democrats, and why?
Well, things have sort of, as the last month of a campaign kind of comes in, you start to see basically partisanship kick in. So on the House side of things, that got kind of a little bit better for Democrats, and it got a little bit worse for them in the Senate, where you saw states like Nevada, states like Tennessee, where you have a pretty centrist Democrat, Phil Bredesen, who's the former governor of Tennessee, running for a Senate seat. And he was a pretty popular guy, and that race was pretty close. But you're starting to see voters sort of kick in and say, well, I kind of like the guy from the opposite party, but I'm going to put on my team jersey and wear it and vote for that person on election day. And that's sort of what's showing up in polls. So you are seeing a little bit of a return to what we generally expect. If it's a red state, you're probably going to think that, well, a lot of those undecided voters that were getting polled in late September, they might be returning home and saying, well, I'm going to vote for my party, even if I'm not loving what the president is doing.
I wanted to ask you about early voting because someone told me over the weekend that early voting wasn't looking great in terms of turnout for Latino voters and millennials. Is somebody just saying that to me without any real knowledge? Help me out here.
So we have kind of a 538 line where we say early voting, there isn't actually any real proof that it gives us a lot of information about, who's going to win an election, Democrat or Republican, because it doesn't, all you know is the early voters, you can tell what their party registration is, but you don't know who they voted for. And a lot of times, as we saw in 2016, where a lot of Democrats voted for Trump, people cross party lines. But I do think that we are probably going to see, unfortunately, certain demographics in this country haven't been reached by the political community, the outreach community. Latinos, I think, are one that Democrats had hoped in 2016 to really turn out and say the Southwest. And even with Trump's inflammatory rhetoric, they really didn't turn out. And I think that's sort of what people are thinking might happen this year. Although I will say, in general, it is predicted to be a high turnout election on both sides, Democrat and Republican.
What about millennials? It seems to me that young people are so energized, at least from everything I see in my social media feed, which maybe I'm not getting a completely clear perspective. But what about those numbers?
I don't think we really know. And I think we kind of have to rely, this is the 538 thing, we kind of have to rely on historical trends. And generally younger voters aren't a constituency that you can necessarily count on to turn out in elections. I will say, going back again, I'm not going to make any predictions because it is going to be a high turnout election. That's what's being sort of forecasted from these polls where pollsters ask about your enthusiasm to vote, and the enthusiasm to vote is extremely high. So perhaps we will see higher numbers of millennials voting.
Are you a little gun shy because of 2016 over there at 538?
No, I think I will say, I think the one thing that is annoying to interview people from the site is that we always kind of do this thing where we'll say, well, we can't predict it. But I will say that we did rethink some of the ways that we present our probabilities for people.
That was kind of a big whiff, Claire.
Well, we will say that we were the least wrong of anyone.
We should
congratulations. Thank you.
We should fact check that, and we should actually also explain to our listeners what these forecasts really mean. So 2 years ago, 538 said Hillary Clinton had a 71% chance to win the presidency. Now, that was notably lower than some of the others. The New York Times said 85%. Huffington Post really went out there and said 98%. But how do these models work, and how do they differ?
Yeah, sure. So the way that the 538 model works is that we take all of the public polling that's available and we put it together and we weight it based on how good we think the pollster is. So better pollsters get a heavier weight in the model. So we take polls, and so that's the poll component. We'll also add in whether or not they're incumbent. That helps a person if they're an incumbent and they're running. We take into account how partisan a state is. We take into account fundraising, how much a candidate has raised. We smush all those things together in a model. And what I always like to point out is 2016 was a really interesting election. Yes, we were, and all of the other models were off. And what was the reason why polls were so off in the 2016 election is that, if you'll remember, Donald Trump had huge media reach. He had 100% name recognition, and he motivated a lot of people who had fallen off the voter rolls to come out and vote. And so polls missed a lot of those people. And so we did have a polling problem in 2016. And I think there's a lot of us in 2018 who are trying to make people basically more, I guess, literate readers of polls, and to know we're not pulling this out of nowhere. And we also want you to know that there is a possibility that this is wrong. This is how probabilities work. So, but I think it's a learning process for all of us to make people better news consumers.
More literally, what you meant 2 years ago was, if you were to run this election with all the information and data we have 10 times, 7 out of 10 times Hillary Clinton would win, and 3 out of 10 times Donald Trump would win. And so it's not like you're, quote, wrong when you say 71% chance to win and she loses. It's that this was one of those events where it was more likely than not that she would win, but she actually didn't.
Yeah. And so this year in our model, we've tried to switch it from making the big, bold number, instead of it having be, it's an 80% chance, we'll try to say, it's a 2 in 6 chance, or it's a 3 in 10 chance that this person will win, just to give people, because I think that when we talk about gambling odds, that's kind of the vernacular that we use. And so we want to try to make it clearer to people what we're saying when we do that.
Let's talk about recent events, Claire, because it has been an insane news cycle. As you know, we had the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. We have the pipe bombs that were sent to a number of Democratic officials, philanthropist George Soros, CNN, and now, most recently, the massacre at that synagogue in Pittsburgh. How do you measure the impact those events have on voters? Yeah,
I guess I'll start with Kavanaugh, since it's a bit easier to parse. The Kavanaugh hearings, certainly senators who were voting on the Kavanaugh hearings, some of them in red states, those red state Democrats, had to make tough choices that I think probably for some of them, let's say Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, probably endangered their chances on the Senate map. And she's someone who's a pretty moderate Democrat. You know, she's from a state that really likes Trump. And she's one of those people that's really been trying to sort of run a campaign that says, listen, I'm first and foremost a North Dakotan. I'm not here for Pelosi and Schumer's agenda, right? As a kind of a response to a lot of Republican tack ads that try to tie red state Democrats to unpopular figures. And so Heidi Heitkamp was sort of chugging along in a reelection effort that was, it's a hard state to win. And when the Kavanaugh vote came up, I think she would be open in saying it was a sort of a wrenching decision for her to have to make, because on the one hand, I think she is a woman who was not in favor of this guy who had been accused of sexual assault. And on the other hand, I think she knew it was a little bit of it was gonna really diminish the chances that she would be able to win her race in that state. And she made the choice. She voted against Kavanaugh, and it has unleashed, a string of basically attacks against her that says, listen, this person is not who you are, North Dakota.
So do you all measure, for example, I spent the weekend in Virginia with my daughter, and we spent the night with a friend of mine from high school, and we were talking about the Kavanaugh hearings, and she was troubled by the way he was treated and felt sympathetic to his outrage when he testified. And I said, hey, you're one of those white suburban women growing up, in Arlington, Virginia, and that's where we were, who is, supporting perhaps Republican candidates because of what happened to Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
Are you able to get that specific in terms of how you're looking at segments of the electorate?
So that doesn't go into the model per se, but you've hit the nail on the head when you bring up demographics that we watch as ones that are shifting post 2016. So if we take, I'm gonna make a wild guess that your friend might be college educated, she might be white, and those people, white college educated women, are kind of the new swing voters. They used to vote Republican pretty steadily, and now I think post-Trump, they are maybe in the middle, like true independent voters, or they're trending Democratic. So I think we'll be watching for women in general and how they vote on election day, but college-educated white women in particular, because they're a constituency that was traditionally Republican, that more and more seem to be moving over to the Democratic side of things.
Well, this was a reality check for me, though, because I think that there are a lot of women who sympathized with him. And Brian, I'm curious, in Los Angeles, that hotbed of conservatism, if you've run up against women who share my friend's point of view.
I actually had a conversation with one woman I know who wouldn't tell me what her personal views are, but said that she was convinced that other women would sympathize with Kavanaugh because we've all seen women who make false allegations to get something. And it was hard for me to imagine what Dr. Ford would get in this situation. I mean, last time I checked, she wasn't even allowed to or able to go back to her own home. But I think we've seen in the data that the Kavanaugh hearings energized a lot of Republican voters who might not have voted, or and motivated some right-leaning independent voters to stick with the Republicans.
Yeah, I think that's fair, because women, these college-educated white women, were probably already a more activated constituency to begin with. So the perceived mistreatment of Kavanaugh, I think, that certainly has played a factor. Now we kind of have the X factor of these really terrible events of the past week, basically, and we're not quite sure how these are going to affect things. I mean, potentially they could have an effect on Trump's approval rating, and that is often a sign of how people might vote in their congressional races. But it's just, I don't mean this to sound flip, but our model does not take into account hate crimes, how that factors into American elections. And unfortunately, that's something that's happening right now.
And doesn't that also, Claire, take a while to seep into the public consciousness and to be reflected in polling data?
It does take a little while to seep in. So we're recording this the week before the election. I'm guessing that pollsters will be putting out polls into the field. They probably started last week after the bombings. And so we might see some data on how people are perceiving those events vis-a-vis the election. Trump's comments in the wake of the synagogue shooting were I found them tonally odd. And I'm not sure how people will react to that. But you're right. It does take a little bit of time for these things to seep in. And, the election is a week away. So we might end up seeing some of those results, frankly, the day of.
But aren't politics local? I mean, is it really a direct reaction to the presidency? In other words, if I live in a state, couldn't I say I don't really like Donald Trump, but I do like, my senator?
That happens less and less. We call it ticket splitting. And because Americans are so much more partisan, we see a lot more people just voting straight down the ticket, Republican or Democratic. There is the old truism, right, that all politics is local. But I think more and more it's become nationalized, in part because this was happening pre-Trump. But I do think Trump he has a talent for driving news cycles. And I think that is something that propelled him into office and continues to dominate our politics news cycle.
Overwhelmingly, we've become much more like a parliamentary system where people aren't paying attention as they used to a generation ago to local factors, local candidates. They're really just voting for what team they want in charge in Washington, particularly in these House and Senate races. I want to ask you about one candidate in particular who's been perhaps the star of this cycle, Beto ORourke in Texas. He has just a 1 in 5 chance to win.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a single poll with him in the lead. He's usually mid to high single digits behind. Have journalists given voters a false sense of his chances, and especially donors who've poured more than $70 million into his campaign?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece about Beto about a month ago that was a little bit premised off this, Brian, and in my lead was basically the number of times he's been compared to a Kennedy. And I think
it was a hilarious piece. Everybody should read it, by the way.
But I think that there's something real there, which is the midterm elections are, I guess, distinctly unsexy as far as there's tons of races. There's not one or two candidates that you can follow along with. And ORourke is young. He's a Democrat making a play in Texas, so there's sort of a substantive political story there. But I do think he is a telegenic person running against Ted Cruz, the Republican incumbent, who is not a particularly beloved figure even by Republicans. Lindsey Graham had a great line that, you could shoot him on the floor of the Senate and none of his colleagues would convict the person who shot him. So he's not, he's not a popular guy, let's say. But I think that the media has a little bit hyped up his chances perhaps to the regular reader or media consumer because of these attractive telegenic.
Well, he's kind of the it guy of the campaign.
And I think what I do think is really real and something to be taken seriously about Beto ORourke. Listen, I think that he probably won't win the Senate election, but he's raised huge, huge amounts of money. Barack Obama 2007 financial quarter kind of money. And the comparison to a former president is on purpose because I think a lot of people say, listen, Donald Trump is a celebrity. He was a celebrity before he was the president. Maybe you need someone who has that kind of ineffable star power if you want to beat Trump. I mean, as much as people want to say that voters care more about policy than they do about politics and the things that seem superficial, it's not true. I think politics is a lot more pheromonic and more like dating or tribalism than it is
like
about
that. Pheromonic. Are you referring to pheromones?
I am, Katie. But what I mean by that is people vote for the person that they like, the person that they think is kind of like,
the person they want to have a beer with, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that
the person I think they want to watch on a screen,
right?
Small or large,
or the person for Democrats who they find inspiring. And I think that the one thing about ORourke's campaign is it has been a positive campaign. He's demographically a person who could perhaps be more appealing to people outside of Texas. He's a young white man with progressive values, which might be more palatable to, Obama Trump voters, which is what we refer to, voters who voted for President Obama, but then switched in 2016 and voted for Trump. So there's a lot of things to think through with Beto ORourke, and I think he represents more than just his Senate campaign in Texas.
Let's just run through a few more campaigns. So Brian's going to be so excited. I'm excited about the first one. And this is the Senate race in Tennessee. And Marsha Blackburn may have to shake it off. Do you like that, you guys?
That was very clever.
I love that.
I just pulled that out of
Do you want to explain it?
Well, Taylor Swift made a big difference when she finally came out of her apolitical cocoon and spoke very candidly about her feelings on Instagram, my favorite social media platform.
And she lives in Tennessee.
Yes, she lives in Tennessee. And then all these people, and all these people came out and registered to vote.
Yeah.
So what's happening there, Claire?
I mentioned Phil Bredesen, the Democratic candidate running against Marsha Blackburn a little earlier. That's a really interesting race because Tennessee is a super red state. It's very Republican. Marsha Blackburn has been a longtime congresswoman, and she really, she actually goes by Congressman Marsha Blackburn. That's her official title. And she sort of took on the Tea Party mantle. So she's a very sort of popular, super conservative candidate. And Phil Bredesen is, he used to be the mayor of Nashville. He brought the Tennessee Titans into the state. He was governor, and he was a sort of popular, moderate governor. If 1992 Bill Clinton were running in the midterms, he'd probably be something like Phil Bredesen, like a Southern moderate Democrat. We've got it as a pretty close race for a red state, in part because of Bredesen is basically an incumbent. He's really well known to the state. And he's a popular guy. And so we're basically, it's almost like the forces of partisanship, super red, super Republican, versus the forces of, I guess, personality and all politics is local. Can Bredesen win on a all politics is local platform in a state that is very, very partisan?
Well, and another interesting little wrinkle in Tennessee, as red as the state is, it has never elected before a right-wing Republican to statewide office, to the Senate or for governor.
I think it's a good point, yeah.
Let's talk about Missouri, Claire McCaskill versus Josh Hawley.
Claire McCaskill is the incumbent Democrat, and Josh Hawley is the attorney general in that state. It's an interesting one. I mean, Claire McCaskill has had some luck that's come her way. The last time she ran against Todd Akin. And if you remember Todd Akin's name, it's because you remember he talked about legitimate rape, which did not play well. And she won that election against
the
Todd.
Ultimate oxymoron.
Yes, exactly. And then she had a little bit of quote unquote luck this year because Missouri had a governor scandal. Eric Greitens, who was the governor, had to resign because of a potential sexual assault that he was accused of. So Missouri's had a weird political year. And so I think Claire McCaskill was doing pretty well because the Republicans in the state, frankly, weren't looking good. They weren't in a good light. But it's a red state. Trump won that state. And Josh Hawley and Claire McCaskill have basically been battling it out over healthcare. We did a podcast on FiveThirtyEight last week where we talked about, the number one campaign ad topic is healthcare. And that's what Claire McCaskill is running on in that state. And Josh Hawley is one of the attorneys general who has signed on to this Make Obamacare Illegal. And so he is in a bit of a tight spot in a state where healthcare is a big issue.
But a lot of Republicans, O'Brien, right? I mean, I've been reading increasingly that Republicans have co-opted the healthcare conversation, or basically presenting themselves as the candidates who are going to preserve and save healthcare and pre-existing coverage for pre-existing conditions, et cetera. And on the other hand, they want to dismantle Obamacare. So, frankly, I'm confused.
Well, they're attempting to do that because healthcare has turned from a good issue for them in the last midterm 4 years ago to a really bad issue for them this time. Under the category of you don't know what you've got until it's gone, a lot of voters are now...
I love when he quotes Joni Mitchell.
Just pandering to Katie.
Don't it always seem to go, Brian?
So a lot of voters are concerned about the protections that they've come to enjoy under the Affordable Care Act going away. And so the Republicans are making a big effort to say, no, we're for preserving protections for people with pre-existing conditions. If Claire McCaskill can't win in Missouri, probably no Democrat can win for federal office, at least in this environment in Missouri, because she's run a really effective campaign. She's a very good senator. And I think if she were to lose, it would be basically just that they want a supporter of Donald Trump's in the Senate.
Claire, let's talk about the governor's race in Florida between Andrew Gillum and Ron DeSantis.
Andrew Gillum is doing pretty well. So as background, Andrew Gillum is the Democrat. He is the black mayor of Tallahassee. And Ron DeSantis is a pretty right-wing Republican. And they are locked in a race that is looking increasingly bad for DeSantis, I think in part because of his pretty far-right policies. Florida is a purple state. Gillum and DeSantis were both kind of surprises in their primaries. On the Democratic side, there were a lot of centrists that people thought would win, and Gillum is kind of trying to run as an outsider. So I think that's appealing to a lot of people. And actually, the governor's race might have cascading effects on the Senate race because Bill Nelson is the Democratic incumbent in the Senate, and he's running against Republican Governor Rick Scott for the seat. And some people are saying, these are both older white men, some people are saying that Gillum might actually turn out certain constituencies that Bill Nelson, the white older man, wouldn't necessarily be able to get on his own.
What's interesting, immediately out of the gate as the general election began, DeSantis got mixed up in racial politics. And arguably it was his own fault because he used the phrase, let's not monkey up the progress that we've made in Florida with a liberal governor. And a lot of people took that to be a racial attack on Andrew Gillum. And it's basically not gone very smoothly for DeSantis since then.
Well, Andrew Gillum was so effective, I think, in the debate, and that soundbite got played over and over again where he said, I'm not saying you're a racist, I'm saying racists think you're a racist.
Right. Good line.
Let's talk about Georgia, the race between Stacey Abrams, who would be the first black female governor in history, and Brian Kemp. There's been so much debate. I saw that President Carter spoke out about this and said that Brian Kemp, who is the Secretary of State for the state of Georgia, should step down from that role during the campaign because he controls a lot of the voting and how it's carried out.
Yeah.
So help us understand that, Claire.
Yeah. So the controversy in Georgia is that it has a pretty restrictive voting law, and a lot of African-American voters, their registrations now have problems, and they might not be able to vote in the election. And what President Carter was saying is basically that Brian Kemp is not an impartial administrator of this election and that he shouldn't be able to administer it. Now, what's interesting about Georgia is, one, it's got these racial dynamics, both in the voting stuff, but also in the candidates themselves, with Stacey Abrams being black and Brian Kemp being a pretty far-right Republican. He's also a white guy. What I think is interesting about this campaign is she is trying to win a southern state as a black woman with a kind of new proposition, which is she's saying, I am going to register and turn out a whole bunch of minorities in addition to winning the moderate swing voters, those white college-educated women, say.
Like my friend.
Like your friend. And that's kind of a new proposition for the South a little bit. I mean, you saw it a little bit with Doug Jones in Alabama in that special election. And I went and hung out with him in the spring and for a profile I did. And Jones is, he's really trying to maintain ties to the black community because they turned out in huge Obama-level numbers for him.
Especially black women.
Yes, exactly. And in order for him to, when he's up for re-election again in 2020, he's going to need to have that huge turnout of those black voters. So the South, we're seeing, potentially with Abrams, a bit of a new dynamic of the kind of candidate that Democrats see as winnable. Because I think that's what's different with Southern Democrats in those deep South states is often, I think black populations have felt like they don't have a viable candidate on a state level that they want to turn out for and vote for. And so I think that's the different dynamic that you're seeing with Stacey Abrams.
When you say problems with their registration or with something associated with their ability to vote, what do you mean by that?
So Georgia's law has it that if anything on your registration card doesn't match your ID, so it could be a typo in your name or a number is off on your address, then it invalidates the voter registration. So if you're thinking that that has echoes to old Southern poll laws, you are right. It's an incredibly restrictive law. And I believe Kemp was, basically caught on tape at a fundraiser saying, I'm going to lose if all these people vote, which I think is probably where President Carter's comments come from a bit. That's quite a skewed thing for a Secretary of State to say. So Georgia certainly has a long history of restrictive voting laws, and it continues in 2018.
Well, and restrictive voting laws could be, to go back to my metaphor from the beginning, the kind of the third seawall against a Democratic wave that Republicans have put up, that particularly in states that they've controlled for some period of time, they can shape the electorate based on who's allowed to vote and who isn't. But those two governors' races are really interesting because they go to a larger debate that's happening within the Democratic Party about where the party should go, particularly in advance of 2020.
Right.
Gillum and Abrams are both considered sort of mobilization candidates. That is, they're more about exciting the base, getting large numbers of millennials, African Americans to turn out with a more explicitly progressive agenda.
Right.
And that's been kind of the way they've been covered by the media. But I would say I think there's a piece that's missing, which is that Gillum and Abrams have both also spent a lot of time and effort trying to win over white moderate swing voters, because they both have to do that because the Democratic base alone is not big enough to win in either of these states. And so I think it's a little bit of a kind of a misperception that they're just doing one and not the other. But anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Finally, Claire, if Democrats win the House, which it looks fairly likely, is that a fair
I'd say
assessment?
that's fair, yes.
How will it change Washington?
I mean, Washington has had basically one-party rule during the Trump administration, which means Republicans have controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House. So I think if Democrats win the House, they will be going gung-ho on oversight. So, looking into Trump's taxes, looking into abuse at certain agencies. The EPA jumps to mind with Scott Pruitt's sort of financial mismanagement. I think there's going to be a lot more vocal oversight of what the Trump administration is doing, and perhaps, investigations will be open. So I think that's one thing. I mean, I think that Nancy Pelosi, if she were sitting here at this table, would say we do not want to impeach the president. And this goes to, Brian's 2020 point about alienating voters. I think people remember how divisive the impeachment proceedings against Bill Clinton were. I think people feel impeachment would almost be a bridge too far. There will certainly be Democrats who will be calling to bring articles of impeachment against President Trump, but I'm not sure that the Democratic leadership wants to go that far and alienate a bunch of people that they need to win over in 2020.
Also, the Senate has to convict, right? I mean,
the Senate has to convict. Yeah, I mean,
so isn't it sort of just kind of
a PR stunt?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
all
I think
of the
it depends.
fun and none of the satisfaction.
It's a base. I think it's a base rallying effort pre-2020. That would be the argument for bringing up impeachment. And I think the counter argument, which again Pelosi vouches for, is listen, we can't do this right now. We need to win. Yes, we need to win the base, but we also need to win Obama-Trump voters in the Midwest.
Clare Malone from FiveThirtyEight. Claire, thanks so much. This was so much fun. I haven't seen Brian this happy in months, honestly.
Oh, my God. This was very big for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was very fun from my end, too.
Before we take a break, a quick announcement. This week is our pre-midterms show. So naturally, next week will be our post-midterm show. Gosh, Brian, I don't know what you're going to do with yourself. As part of that show, by the way, we want you, our listeners, to call in and tell us what you think.
We really want to know what's on your mind, what questions you have about what it all means. So if you'd like to talk with Katie or me, which is hard to believe, but mostly if you'd like to talk to Katie, call 929-224-4637. Leave a voicemail anytime between now and Wednesday morning, and we'll select a few of you to be on next week's show. In your voicemail, make sure to tell us where you're from, why you're calling, and your phone number so that we can call you back.
We can't wait to hear from you. Again, that number is 929-224-4637. And we'll be back with Michael Lewis to talk about the decay of the federal government. Yippee! That's right after this. America is changing, and with it, we are facing numerous financial challenges. So Prudential and financial wellness expert Alexandra Drain are traveling all across America to learn more about the changing financial landscape in a new project that is called The State of Us.
Drain has devoted her career to inspiring people to lead healthier, happier, and more engaged lives. So you can join her as she partners with Prudential, and they travel across the country talking to real people from the town with the longest lifespan to the town with the highest birth rate to the smallest town in America, where I assume like one lonely dude lives.
Today, less than half of us believe we're on track to meet our financial goals. So the State of Us works to uncover the challenges getting in the way of financial wellness and teaches us how to combat them. If you want to learn more about the financial challenges facing our country, visit prudential.com/stateofus. That's prudential.com/stateofus.
Support for today's show comes from Thrive Market, an online marketplace that's on a mission to make healthy living easy and affordable for everyone. You'll get access to thousands of the best-selling organic foods and natural products at 25 to 50% below traditional retail prices. And Katie, I know that is music to your ears.
Hey, cut it out, Brian. Everyone knows I'm cheap by now. But whether you're vegan, gluten-free, or feeding a family, you can choose from 80-plus qualities to get everything you need, including non-GMO, fair trade certified, and BPA free. For every paid membership, this is also really cool. A free membership is given to a low-income family, public school teacher, military veteran, or first responder.
I'm a big fan of this service. I love their prices, of course, the speed that they deliver, the zero waste packaging, and the lavender essential oil, which I got, and it's very relaxing.
Okay, TMI, but that's nice. And now with a special link, Thrive Market is giving you an extra 25% off your first purchase, plus a free 30-day trial. That's 25% off the already low prices that Thrive Market offers. So just go to thrivemarket.com/Katie Couric to access this discount. We promise you're going to love this service. Now, before we talk with Michael Lewis, we have an important message for you, and that message is, it's fun when everybody votes. That's my new voting song, Brian.
Yeah, Katie, I think what you're saying is it's really important that everybody votes.
And that they sing along with me. Research shows that the majority of young people still are not sure whether they'll vote. Can you believe that? What is wrong with you people? Brian, does that mean you're not sure yet?
Well, I don't think I'm still considered a young person anymore, sadly. Anyway, if I am, I'm in the minority because I am already 100% positive that I'm going to vote, and I even have a plan to do so. And how self-confident do I sound?
You sound very confident, and I am as well. I plan to vote, but I get it. Some of you young people don't know where to vote. You're not sure what's on the ballot. You don't want to vote the wrong way, or maybe you just think your vote doesn't matter.
Well, surprise, surprise, we're here to tell you it does matter. Look at 2000, look at 2016. One vote per precinct can make all the difference. And lucky for all of us, our friends at Crooked Media have launched Vote Save America, a step-by-step guide to answer all of your questions.
On votesaveamerica.com, you can check if you're registered and register if you're not. You can see what the rules are in your state about registration deadlines and voter ID. You can learn more about candidates and close races, and you can look at a ballot guide that explains what is on your specific ballot in plain English.
So visit votesaveamerica.com and remember to vote on November 6th.
We turn now to Michael Lewis. He's written bestsellers like The Blind Side, The Big Short, and Moneyball, all of which were adapted for the big screen, by the way.
Michael has a knack for taking a topic that seems boring or complicated, like statistics in baseball, for example, and making it very exciting and relevant. And that's exactly what he's done in his latest book, which is called The Fifth Risk.
The new book tackles the decay of the federal government under the Trump administration. So we'll talk with Michael about why this could be really, really dangerous for the world, for our country, and how it could be stopped. Michael Lewis, welcome to the podcast. We're thrilled to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
I know that your book tries to pull back the curtain and really show people what the impact of 2 years of the Trump administration has had on the federal government. And you really talk about the importance of the transition from the very beginning as there's a transition from one administration to another. So tell us why this period of time is so critical.
Well, the United States government, unlike most governments in the world, has a layer of leadership that's politically appointed. 4,000 or so people who actually run the place are appointed by the president. And what you have after a presidential election, assuming that the incumbent doesn't win, is someone's leaving with their 4,000 people who've been running the place for a while. And someone's coming in with their 4,000 people, many of whom have never been there before. There's this transfer of knowledge that is absolutely critical. And it has nothing to do with political ideology. It's a sort of how-to. So you go into the Department of Energy and they say, we manage the nuclear arsenal. Here's how you test atomic weapons without actually blowing one up.
Pretty important stuff.
In fact, you can think of the federal government as like this huge portfolio of risks that are being managed, and many of which we don't even really think about. And the idea is that, before the election, well before the election, the candidates of both major parties have hundreds of people waiting to rush in the day after the election, because you really only have from that day until the inauguration. And then by law, the people who've left are not allowed to get in touch with the people who are there. They can be solicited. And the thing that interested me in this story in the first place, because I did not have a native interest in the Department of Agriculture, it didn't occur to me that would be material, was that the Obama administration, partly because there was a law requiring them to do it, but partly because Bush had handed the government off so well to Obama, had gone to great lengths to create essentially the best course ever created in how the government works. 1,000 people across the government for the better part of the year putting together briefings. So if you got made Secretary of the Interior, you would be briefed by people who really understood how the Interior Department worked, and you'd be hit the ground running. They were expecting the day after the election for hundreds of people to come in.
So let's back up one day before those meetings to election night, and you tell this really incredible story about Mike Pence and his wife, which is really indicative of how the Trump people felt about their chances of winning.
And may explain the chaos of the transition.
No, so this is absolutely right. The key to the whole thing is they weren't running to win. They didn't think they were going to win. Bannon would take exception to this. Bannon may have actually in his heart of hearts believed it, but most everybody involved with it thought, including Trump, was not prepared to win. So they had not written an acceptance speech. They had written a concession speech. That explains why a lot of people are willing to go along for the ride and how they go along for the ride. Because they aren't thinking this man is going to actually run the federal government. They're thinking he's building a brand, I think is what they were thinking. And I'm building my brand, being associated with it for some period of time. I'm not actually preparing to govern the country. The Mike Pence story was, Karen Pence, Mike's wife, Mike apparently leaned over to kiss her when Pennsylvania was called for Trump and it was clear Trump was going to be president. And she says, pushes him away and says, "You got what you wanted, Mike, leave me alone." And I said,
ouch.
Yeah, no, I don't. She would. The people in the room, some of them had really mixed feelings about winning. And Trump himself had been playing the game. It's like he really is a guy whose bluff is called. He had not taken seriously the idea he had to take over this operation.
But Chris Christie had been appointed head of the transition. And what happened right after election night to him?
So what you really need to know is what happened before, because Christie had seen in the newspaper that they were required to prepare for the transition and that there were federal resources available to do it. And he called Trump and said, "Let me do it." Because he said, "I'm not going to be president, but the next best thing is kind of planning to be president." And this isn't my view. This is a view of just independent referees. Christie did a superb job. He got lots of really qualified people ready to go into the agencies and had also vetted a lot of the people who might be plausible candidates for the top jobs in the government. So they'd vetted out Mike Flynn, for example. And it's all ready to go, in spite of Donald Trump's actual hostility to the whole operation because he thought they were spending his money. And
that he wasn't going to win.
And he wasn't going to win, right. So why bother, right? And Bannon said to Trump, "Well, if you fire the transition, how's that going to look on Morning Joe? It's going to look like you're giving up already." And so he said, "All right, just don't spend very much money."
But ultimately, he did fire Chris Christie.
So the day after the election, they fire him. So it was only for show. They built this great operation. It turns out only for show, that the minute they said, "Oh, we're going to do this," Trump got rid of him. And the natural next question is, why? And Christie would tell you that it's because he put Jared Kushner's father in jail back when he was a prosecutor for tax fraud.
Do you think that's true?
I think that didn't help. Jared clearly wanted Christie gone, but you had to have Trump's approval of that. And why would Trump, if I were Donald Trump, I would have somewhere deep in my soul a sense that I don't really know how this thing works that I'm going to be taking over. And it'd be nice to have all these people who kind of know the thing, and I don't have to pay attention to it then, right? It'll all just kind of run. I think he had positive reasons for wanting chaos. I think that there were friends of his, people who had connections to Russia, like Mike Flynn, who he wanted to be able to put in important positions. I think he functions better. I think he thinks he functions better if things are not orderly. So I think he was just kind of attracted to, like, let the chips fall where they may. I'll take care of all this. I'll decide who's going to be in the cabinet, mainly by casting them by appearance. And it wasn't sufficient that Jared Kushner wanted Christie out. Trump also had to say, I want this whole thing gone.
You're saying that he wanted Mike Flynn in there because of his connections with Russia.
I can't imagine why else. Like, why else go to that trouble? Christie's operation had said Mike Flynn should not be national security advisor. He's got shadowy problems you don't want to know about, but just don't put him in any important position. The Trumps are insistent that Mike Flynn be in, and to the point where they want to get rid of the entire transition operation, which would prevent it from happening. Why else? I mean, it's hard to, it seems I don't know this for a fact, but it seems a plausible explanation.
And to what end?
You know, I wonder about this. I think that we will find out eventually when we untangle Donald Trump's finances and his relationship to the Russians. What he's thinking in the back of his lizard brain is, if this proceeds normally and the State Department is run normally, for example, it'd be harder to cloud my relations with these people. People are going to know things, find out things, people who aren't allies. I want allies. I want loyalists around this issue, because loyalists will keep their trap shut. That, if I had to bet. But again, I don't know that. But never mind the motive for a second. Just the fact of it is astonishing. You know, in a normal society that understood the value of its government, there'd have been a revolt. We're not going to show up for the briefings. It's crazy. I mean, 3 months ago, when I was finishing, I was still getting briefings from very important people in the government that had never been given because no one had ever showed up to hear it. And it's just a loss of knowledge. Who would run anything that way? It's just, there's no decent argument for not learning about the thing you need to run.
Which leads perfectly to the title of the book, The Fifth Risk. Can you go through the first 4 risks, and then we'll talk about the fifth one?
Well, there's something that's not in the book that informed the title. When I first started, I was talking to people in the White House, and they had planned a exercise which was going to happen between the outgoing Obama cabinet and the incoming Trump cabinet. They would scheme out what happens if several terrible things happen. One was a pandemic. Another was a terrorist attack inside the United States with a nuclear weapon. Another was a hurricane that surprised some part of the country. The fourth was an earthquake in the Pacific Northwest. And I said, what's the fifth? They said, we hadn't thought about the fifth. And I realized that what I was writing about at that moment was the stuff that nobody's thinking about, because there's so much of it within the federal government. It's sort of like the risk we're not attending to sufficiently. This then happens again when I go into the energy department and I'm sitting down with a guy who'd never given his briefing, the chief risk officer.
And he worked in the Obama administration.
He worked in the Obama administration. He was brought in by Ernie Moniz, MIT physicist who had run the energy department. His name is John McWilliams. And John said, I came up with a list of 142 basically existential risks. I said, don't have time. Pretend I'm like a Trump guy who's bored. Give me 5. And he says, I think in no particular order, but he says, 1, that a nuclear weapon will go off when it's not supposed to. I think he said then the Iran deal would come unraveled, that the next administration would not appreciate how important it was and how good a deal it was, because they wouldn't bother to listen to the physicists who would explain to them that now Iran cannot build a nuclear bomb. And that's exactly what happened. North Korea was the third. The failure of the nation's an electrical grid, which is they monitor, and you think, oh, well, that's just the lights go out. That's a disaster. People die. And then we get the 5th. And actually, he said, I got to think a little bit. And I thought, well, we have a pattern. When we get to 5, we got to think a little bit. And then he finally said, very kind of innocuously, program management. And what he meant by that, which sounds incredibly tedious, and in some ways it is incredibly tedious, but what he means by that is that the government is managing really dangerous situations that are very long-term situations. And the example I plucked out of the Department of Energy to use to illustrate the point in the book was the nuclear waste cleanup in Hanford, Washington. Eastern Washington is where the plutonium was created for the atom bombs that were dropped on Japan. In the course of creating it, they were in such a rush, they didn't pay attention to what they were doing with the waste materials. Hundreds of millions of gallons filled with stuff you don't want to touch.
Or be anywhere near.
Or be anywhere near. I mean, a lot of people who've worked at this site have died of cancer. Have been just poured into the soil. And there's this plume of it moving through the earth towards the Columbia River. And it's being managed by the Department of Energy. They're spending $3 billion a year to clean this up. If we just don't do that right, and the stuff gets to the Columbia River, it's catastrophic for the Pacific Northwest. He said that was just one example. That's professional, technical management that's got to be there. People who know about things. And that's what the Trump people didn't bring in. They didn't bring anybody who knew about anything.
It sounds like you really outline a lot of disasters waiting to happen, and not just at the Department of Energy, but in other very, frankly, unsexy agencies like the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Commerce.
Right. So the whole point was to take things that nobody's paying attention to.
Which is kind of your area of expertise. I feel like you always take these sort of arcane, dry subjects and you kind of make them fun and entertaining.
You have to hear 3 or 4 times that you should read the book before you actually think, I better read the book.
Yeah.
Because really do I want to read a book about the Department of Agriculture.
But talk about the Department of Agriculture and Commerce. And I think a lot of listeners, Michael, will be surprised to hear what they have purview over and how important they are.
They're all misnamed, these departments.
Right?
I mean, we've gotten so detached from our government. So the reason I picked the ones I picked was I just wanted to dramatize how little we all know about what our government does. But the Department of Agriculture, it does subsidize farming. It was created by Lincoln during the middle of the Civil War, with the explicit mission to turn agriculture into a science. So farming could be made more efficient. So we'd need fewer farmers. So those people could then go do other things and the economy would grow. The enterprise has been spectacularly successful. Farmers used to feed a few people. Now they each feeds a few hundred people and we need many fewer farmers. It is now expanded into a science project that distributes about $3 billion a year in grants to researchers. Almost all of them, one way or another, related to how we secure the food supply in the face of climate change.
And food safety, by the way. I just want to interject food safety.
Food safety, yeah. How do we make sure that our chicken doesn't poison us? Among other things, the Department of Agriculture inspects the 9 billion birds a year that are killed in America so we can eat them.
Not to mention cows and all kinds of other things,
all kinds
right?
of other things. Now, if you're hiring someone to pass out $3 billion a year in grants, you probably want to hire someone who knew about agricultural research. And that's usually who occupies the job, a scientist, someone who's done their own research, is respected in the field. And that's who was there when Trump came in. And Trump nominated to replace her a right-wing talk show radio host from Iowa who supported him, who has no science background whatsoever. I mean, just this kind of stuff. It's like I don't know about agricultural science, but I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express. It's like happened across the government. So that's $3 billion a year. I think the Agriculture Department budget is close to $200 billion. And much of that, if you follow just the money, it's feeding people. It's feeding poor kids, it's feeding old people, it's food stamps, and it's school nutrition programs. That's where the bulk of the money goes. And those programs, when you actually dig into them and talk to the people who administer them, the Trump people would love to cut them, but what you're doing is you're leaving kids hungry and old people hungry. I describe how ignorance is actually a tool for Trump. That if you remain ignorant of the thing, you can do all sorts of brutal stuff.
And you can have plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability. You can as long as you don't meet a kid who's going hungry and as a result can't concentrate at school, as a result one thing leads to another and the life ends in tragedy, you can say, oh yeah, let's just cut the school lunch program. In fact, when you get into it, you find these dedicated public servants who really understand the programs and understand that, like, the problem with the programs isn't fraud, which is what some people have you believe. There's very little fraud, and they work very hard to eliminate it. The problem is they're not as heavily used as they should be, that the people who need them don't have too much trouble getting access to them. And the people who really care about them solve those problems on a state-by-state basis. When you don't we don't acknowledge any of that. When you just say, oh, just get rid of it, the government's too big, what you're doing is just ignoring the problem altogether.
Well, and when you say that government workers are these incompetent bureaucrats who don't know what they're doing, you sort of support the idea of just cutting off all these programs, no matter how valuable they are.
I think that's absolutely right. And what I found in talking to these people, bureaucrats, civil servants, public servants, was that they were, as a rule, extraordinarily dedicated, hardworking, mission-driven people operating in a hugely dysfunctional system. And the fact that system is dysfunctional is our fault, not theirs. It's because we've resisted any kind of decent reforms of government. If you want to make the argument that our society is disintegrating and in decay, you might start by looking at what we've done with the government. 5 times as many people in the federal workforce over the age of 60 than under the age of 30.
Wow.
$90 billion spent on IT in the federal government. $70 billion is spent just on these just maintaining these ancient decrepit systems from the 60s. It's a system that's almost built at this point to fail. And in spite of that, people want to come in and do stuff, and sometimes do.
Did President Obama, when he was in charge, do anything to try to fix these problems you've identified?
Not enough. The Bush administration had been beginning to engage with how you reform the government, and the Obama administration has kind of started over. The world's authority on this is Max Stier, who runs something called the Partnership for Public Service, which is this extraordinary nonprofit started by one guy who basically said, I'm going to try to fix the government. I'm going to start by trying to get young, talented people into the government. The only way I can do that is if I fix this thing. He's managed to get the laws passed that require people to prepare for the transition. And he's got a lot of ideas about ways you might reform the place so it is more agile, responsive, and just works better. And he would tell you that Obama was disappointing to him this way, but nothing like Trump. I mean, really responsible in the kind of people he put into the government, for example, that he said, you've never seen anything like Trump.
We're 2 years into the Trump administration. Do you see it getting any better? And if the Democrats, Michael, take the House, will they have any control over the current state of disarray?
So the answer is no and no. Trump is symptom, not just cause here. We don't elect someone who is so ignorant and negligent unless we have got to the point where we so misvalue and misunderstand the thing he's running. If the society understood the government, if we all had a good civics lesson, we'd all say that person shouldn't be running that because that's going to be a catastrophe, because that enterprise, the government, is really important. The narrative needs to change first. I mean, that's why I wrote the book. I mean, if they just try to start to change the narrative so people stop seeing the government as the problem and start seeing it as a tool, as a solution.
Good luck with that, by the way.
But no, if this society is going to survive, that's got to happen. So it's a big deal. I think it actually could happen, but you can change narratives. You know this. You've told stories.
But
right?
Yeah, we have to stop undermining this institution
and start trying to be constructive about it.
And understanding it. And meanwhile, if the Democrats take the House, they don't really have any power to do this, do they? If
Trump is removed, that would help, but it wouldn't solve the core problems. What's really needed is a political leader, probably will come out of the Democratic Party, but could easily come out of the Republican Party, who can make the positive case for government, which is with caveats, which we need to change this thing. We have a 1940s automobile on a 21st century highway. Someone who can sell that case, I think, could get elected selling that case. They just have to be good at it.
And this is something that President Obama may try to sell because he's optioned the book.
Correct.
To come up with a series for Netflix to help people better understand the government.
Yes. It's just as a civics lesson. That's right. And I did 3 departments because it would be the work of many lifetimes to do the whole government. But you could do this in a fun way across the entire government.
Well, Michael Lewis, the book is called The Fifth Risk. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about it. It's always great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So that's all for today. And a reminder one more time, please vote on Tuesday, November 6th in the midterm elections. It is really important.
And on next week's show, we'll be taking your calls and making sense of all the election results.
Or at least trying to. Emma Morgenstern is our producer, Nora Ritchie is the associate producer, and Jared O'Connell is our audio engineer who makes every show sound like a dream. Ryan Connor is our audio engineer here in LA.
I'd also like to shout from the rooftops about my team at Katie Couric Media, my assistant Beth DeMaz, and Julia Lewis, my social media mix. And a saucy one at that.
Jared Arnold wrote our new theme music. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at GoldsmithB. And you can follow Katie on Twitter, Facebook, and especially Instagram under Katie Couric. Those Instagram stories are really something to follow.
I notice you do, Brian, because I see your name all the time, so don't mock me too much. One more reminder, if you want to call in to ask us a question or share your thoughts about the midterms, you can reach us at 929-224-4637. Just leave a voicemail with your name, where you're calling from, and what you'd like to tell us, or leave us a message about something other than the midterms, or you can always email us at comments@couricpodcast.com. Thank you, as always, for listening. We really appreciate your support, and we'll talk to you next week. Did you all know as many as 15 million Americans have been diagnosed with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease? November is National COPD Awareness Month. It's a serious disease that makes it really hard to breathe, and it can get worse over time. And while it's not curable, there are treatment options available to help you breathe better. So talk with your doctor about a plan that fits your lifestyle. For more information, visit womeningovernment.org.
This podcast is sponsored by ADT. ADT can design and install a smart home just for you, backed by 24/7 protection, like Doorman Service, which is an ADT automation that unlocks the door for packages, friends, or your kids.
Just visit ADT.com/smart to learn more about how ADT can design and install a secure smart home just for you.
Stitcher.
The first episode featured... Sorry.
Okay, I'll do... You should
I'll do it. I can do it. The first episode...
Dead puppies, dead puppies, dead puppies.
I mean, it's not like a brutal murder during the course of an armed robbery was a routine daily event in this part of the state, right? This is something that happened very, very infrequently.
Adel, Georgia, a town of roughly 5,000 people not far from the Florida state line. In 1998, there was a shocking murder there.
Police investigators quickly put a man in jail for the crime. He swore he was innocent.
Basically, they was going to get somebody black for killing that lady.
But then, some 18 months later, a second brutal murder.
And just months after that, 2 more.
You see something savagery like that, it's like, you know, somebody that does that is a straight psychopath.
And the chance of 2 different people doing the same kinds of things, I mean, it just seems kind of crazy, right?
I'm Jordan Smith.
And I'm Liliana Segura. We're reporters for The Intercept. Together, we have more than 30 years of experience investigating wrongful convictions.
We know how they happen, and how putting the wrong person in prison for murder means a killer goes free.
Murderville, Georgia. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.